Kicked out, he built a home inside a chimney. Oscar Lindqvist, who had survived 19 Leadville winters, told him flatly, "You'll freeze before Christmas, and that boy of yours will be an orphan by New Year's." He had $6, a 9-year-old son, and needed 4 cords of firewood he could not buy. On December 17, 1893, the temperature fell 42 degrees in 9 hours. But 3 months earlier, Emil Varga had never spent a single night without a coal stove since arriving in America. He came to Leadville in the autumn of 1889, following the promise that drew 10,000 others to the highest city in the nation, silver. The mines above town pulled ore from the earth at a rate that made millionaires of men who had arrived with nothing. Emil wasn't looking to become a millionaire. He wanted steady wages, $3 a day, enough to feed a wife and a young son, enough to send money home to Hungary, enough to believe that leaving everything behind had been the right choice. The Malta Smelting Works hired him as a slag handler, the lowest job in the facility, the one that required nothing but a strong back and a tolerance for heat. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, he shoveled the waste rock that floated atop molten metal, loading it into carts that carried it to the growing slag heaps outside town. The work was brutal. The heat from the furnaces could blister skin at 10 paces. The fumes left men coughing blood by their 40th birthday. Emil didn't complain. He had a cabin, company housing, 1 room with a coal stove, rent deducted from his wages at $1.50 per week. He had food. He had a son named Paul, who the Americans called Paul, and who was learning to read English faster than his father could speak it. His wife died of typhoid in 1891. The company gave him 3 days off for the funeral. On the 4th day, he was back at the slag pits. The work didn't stop for grief. Nothing in Leadville stopped for grief. For 2 years after that, Emil lived in a kind of suspended silence. He worked. He fed his son. He sent less money to Hungary because there was less money to send. The other workers, Irish, Cornish, a few Germans, tolerated him but didn't befriend him. Hungarians were rare in Leadville. He was a stranger among strangers, and he had stopped trying to be anything else. Then the silver died. It happened faster than anyone thought possible. In late October of 1893, Congress repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. The price of silver, which had held steady at 83 cents an ounce, collapsed to 62 cents overnight. Mines that had operated for 15 years shuttered within a week. The smelters that processed their ore had nothing left to process. The Malta Smelting Works announced its closure on September 28th. The foreman walked through the facility handing out final pay envelopes and eviction notices. 5 days, he said to each man. Company policy. The cabins need to be cleared for whatever comes next. Emil opened his envelope. $6. 2 days' wages minus deductions. He had worked at Malta for 4 years. This was what remained. He walked home through streets that had changed overnight. Leadville had held 40,000 people at its peak, though it was down to perhaps 15,000 now. In the coming weeks, it would lose half of those. But on that first day, no one had left yet. 2,500 men had simply stopped working, and they filled the streets with a kind of stunned silence, as if the mountains themselves had betrayed them. The boarding houses filled by noon. Emil watched men he recognized from the smelter arguing with landlords, offering watches and wedding rings for a week's shelter. The saloons did tremendous business, men drinking away money they would need for food, because what else was there to do with money when there was no future to spend it on? Paul was waiting in the cabin when Emil returned. The boy was 9 years old, dark-haired, serious in a way that children become when they learn too early that the world is not safe. He didn't ask what had happened. He had heard the rumors. Everyone had heard the rumors. "We have to leave?" he asked. "In 5 days." Where will we go? Emil didn't have an answer. He spent those 5 days looking for options. There were none. A room in a boarding house cost $15 to $25 a month, meals included. Emil had $6. A room without meals, just a bed in a shared space, cost $8. 40 miles away in Granite. Emil walked 40 miles away in Granite. Emil walked to the county office and asked about admission. The clerk looked at him with the particular contempt reserved for able-bodied men seeking help. "The poorhouse is for those who cannot work," the clerk said. "Widows, orphans, the infirm. You look healthy enough. If you can't find work, that's your own failing." "There is no work." "Then you'll need to look elsewhere. And if you're found vagrant in Lake County, you'll be put on a road gang. Your boy will be sent to the orphan home in Denver." The orphan trains. Emil had heard of them, eastbound cars carrying destitute children to foster placement in distant states. Families separated permanently. Children vanished into the vastness of America, never seen again. He couldn't let that happen, but he couldn't see a way to prevent it. On the 4th day, with 1 day remaining before eviction, Emil walked to California Gulch to see the only man in Leadville who had ever shown him kindness. Oskar Lindqvist was Swedish, 58 years old, a former shift boss at the Harrison Reduction Works, before that smelter closed in 1885. He lived alone in a shack he'd built from salvaged lumber, surviving on odd jobs and a reputation for knowing more about Leadville winters than any man alive. Lindqvist was sitting outside his shack when Emil arrived, smoking a pipe and watching the sky. His left hand was missing 3 fingers, lost to frostbite in 1881, the winter that killed more men than all the mine accidents combined. "I heard about Malta," Lindqvist said. "Heard about all of them. 90 mines closed, 2,500 men out. It's going to be a hard winter." "I need advice," Emil said. "I have $6, a son, no shelter after tomorrow. What do I do?" Lindqvist drew on his pipe and said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was flat. "You need a stove, fuel, walls. You have none of these." He gestured at the mountains ringing the valley. "Up here, at 10,000 feet, the winter starts in October and doesn't end until May. The temperature drops to 20 below on an average January night, 30 below when it's bad. I've seen it hit 40 below. I've seen men freeze standing up." The churches. "Overwhelmed. 2,500 men just lost their jobs. The Methodists can maybe feed 100. The Catholics another 100. What happens to the other 2,300? The mine tunnels. I've heard men can shelter there. Constant 45 degrees, yes. Also constant damp. You'll catch lung sickness inside a month. And the company guards patrol the good tunnels. They'll arrest you for trespassing, and your boy ends up on the orphan train anyway." Emil looked out at the landscape, the barren hills, the stripped forest, the abandoned smelter works dotting the valley with their cold smokestacks. "What about the old smelters, the buildings?" "The buildings are gone, stripped for lumber years ago. The only things left standing are the stacks, and you can't live in a brick tube. I've worked those smelters. The inside of a stack is cold as a grave, all that masonry sucking the warmth right out of your body." "So there's nothing." Lindqvist met his eyes. "I'm telling you the truth because lying would be crueler. A man without a stove is a dead man walking in Leadville. You've got one choice. Find work or leave. There's nothing in between." "And if I can't find work? If I can't leave?" Lindqvist knocked out his pipe against a rock. "Then you'll freeze, and your boy will freeze with you. I'm sorry, that's not the answer you want, but it's the only honest one I have." Emil walked back toward town through the ruins of the Malta smelting works. The wooden buildings had been stripped years ago, their lumber scavenged by other desperate men. What remained were foundations, rusted machinery, and the brick smokestack rising 100 feet into the thin air. The late afternoon sun struck the western face of the stack. Without thinking, Emil stopped and leaned against it. The brick was warm. He stood there for a long moment, his palm pressed flat against the surface. The warmth was unmistakable, not hot, but warmer than the 40-degree air surrounding him. He walked around the base of the stack. The southern and western faces were warm. The eastern face, in shadow since morning, was cool. Something stirred in his memory. His grandmother's house in Hungary. The masonry stove that dominated her kitchen, a massive structure of brick and ceramic tile built into the wall that held heat for days after the fire went out. The men at the smelter called the stacks heat sinks because they stayed warm long after the furnaces went cold, but no one sheltered in them. Lindqvist had dismissed the idea immediately. The stacks were cold inside, he'd said, all that masonry sucking warmth out. Emil walked to the base of the stack and examined the ventilation arch, a rectangular opening 10 feet wide and 12 feet tall, where the flue duct had once connected the furnaces to the chimney. The duct was gone, sold for scrap. What remained was a wound in the brick, open to the wind. Cold air poured through constantly. He could feel it, a steady flow drawn upward by the physics of the stack. Hot air rises. Cold air rushes in to replace it. The chimney was designed to create draft, to pull air from the furnaces and carry smoke into the sky. But what if the base were sealed? He stepped inside the arch and looked up. The stack narrowed as it rose, perhaps 14 feet in diameter at the base, tapering to 6 feet at the top. The walls were 3 feet thick at ground level, solid brick mortared with Portland cement, 800 tons of masonry, soaking up sunlight all day, every day. If he sealed the ventilation arch, the draft would stop. The warm air trapped inside would have nowhere to go. The heat stored in all that brick would radiate inward instead of escaping upward. It would be like his grandmother's stove, except the fuel wouldn't be wood or coal. The fuel would be the sun. He returned the next morning with a measuring cord and a stub of pencil. The arch was 10 feet wide, 12 feet tall. He would need lumber for framing, salvaged boards from the stripped smelter buildings, canvas for weatherproofing that would cost money, maybe $1.50 for a sufficient piece. Mud and clay for chinking, free from the creek bed if he dug it himself. He was crouched in the arch, sketching dimensions on a scrap of paper, when a voice behind him said, "They told me the Hungarian had finally lost his mind. I didn't believe them." Henrik Mazur stood at the edge of the ruins. He was Polish, 41 years old, a furnace tender at Malta until yesterday. Emil had worked alongside him for years without exchanging more than a few words. Mazur had a wife and 3 children. He'd been sleeping in a tent on Chicken Hill since the eviction, the open slope above town where the desperate made camp. "I'm measuring," Emil said. "I can see that. What I can't see is why." Mazur walked closer, examining the arch with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years working around industrial structures. "You're thinking of sheltering in here. If I seal the opening, you seal yourself in a coffin." Mazur shook his head. "I worked these stacks for 6 years. The inside is always cold. The draft pulls heat straight up and out. You put walls across this arch. You trap dead air, cold, dead air. The bricks will suck the warmth right out of your body." Emil had heard this argument from Lindqvist. Sunsets. The heat doesn't disappear. It sunsets. The heat doesn't disappear. It moves through the brick, slowly, an inch per hour, roughly. These walls are 3 feet thick. The warmth absorbed today reaches the inside tomorrow, and tomorrow there's more sun, and the day after that. Mazur stared at him. You're saying the chimney stores heat like a stove? Like a stove, except the fuel is free. That's... Mazur trailed off. He was a practical man, not a theoretical one. The idea was too strange to accept or reject immediately. That's not how chimneys work. That's not how chimneys were designed to work. But the physics doesn't care about design. Brick stores heat. The sun provides heat. If I trap it inside instead of letting it escape. If you're wrong, Mazur interrupted, you and your boy freeze to death. You understand that? There's no backup plan here. You put all your time into this madness. You're not looking for real shelter, not begging for charity, not doing anything that might actually save you. Real shelter costs money I don't have. Charity is overwhelmed. What's left? Mazur had no answer. He looked at the arch, at the walls rising above them, at the distant sun that would set in a few hours and return tomorrow to heat 800 tons of brick. My tent is on Chicken Hill, he said finally. There's room for 2 more. It's cold, but it's something. Come stay with us while you think about this. Thank you, Emil said, but I've already thought about it. Mazur left. Emil returned to his measurements. He had $4.50 remaining. The canvas would cost $1.50. That left $3, enough for flour and lard to last perhaps 2 weeks. If the chimney worked, 2 weeks would be enough time to find some other way to survive. If it didn't work, 2 weeks of food wouldn't matter anyway. He walked to the mercantile and made his purchase. The clerk looked at the canvas, looked at Emil, and said nothing. Men were buying strange things these days. The eviction came the next morning. A company man knocked on the cabin door at 8 o'clock and waited while Emil and Paul gathered their possessions. There wasn't much: blankets, cooking pot, a small bag of flour, a Bible that had belonged to Emil's wife. Paul carried his school books. He still attended the public school when he could. Emil insisted on that even when there was work to be done. A boy who could read had a future. A boy who couldn't had nothing but his back. They walked to the Malta stack through morning light that was already cold enough to show their breath. Paul had asked where they were going. Emil had explained. The boy had listened with the serious attention he brought to everything, then nodded. The bricks hold heat, he'd said. I understand. Whether he truly understood or simply trusted his father, Emil couldn't tell. It didn't matter. Trust was enough for now. The work began immediately. Emil had gathered salvaged lumber the day before, broken boards and beams from the stripped smelter buildings, sorted by length, stacked near the arch. The framing was crude carpentry, the kind a man could manage without training if he had patience and didn't mind mistakes. He had neither patience nor tolerance for mistakes. Would be worse. Every hour mattered. He would be worse. Every hour mattered. He worked until his hands bled. The hammer blows were clumsy. He'd never been a carpenter, and it showed. Nails bent, board split. He drove his thumb twice in the first hour and kept working with blood dripping from the nail bed. Paul tried to help, holding board steady, fetching tools, but a 9-year-old's strength had limits. By noon, Emil had framed 1/3 of the arch. At this rate, he would need 3 full days. He didn't have 3 days. He barely had 3 hours. Franklin Jessup arrived at 2 o'clock, picking his way through the ruins with the careful steps of a man who didn't want to dirty his shoes. He was 45 years old, American-born, the owner of Leadville's largest hardware store, or what had been the largest hardware store before. The crash emptied his credit ledger of any hope of repayment. Jessup had extended credit to half the miners in town. Now those miners were unemployed, fleeing, or dead. He would never see his money again. But he still owned property, including, Emil now learned, the parcel where the Malta stack stood. You're trespassing, Jessup said without preamble. This is my land. Bought it at tax auction when the smelter company defaulted. Emil's English was functional but slow under pressure. The smelter is gone. The land is empty. Empty but owned. What you're doing here is theft of occupancy. In this state, that's a criminal offense. The sheriff can take you to jail and you're a boy to the orphan train. Paul was standing 20 feet away, holding a board. He'd gone still at the word sheriff. He understood that word. I am only building, Emil said. I take nothing. You're taking shelter you haven't paid for. Jessup looked at the half-completed frame, at the salvaged lumber, at the canvas folded nearby. You want to stay? $10 a month rent, pay by the week. $10 a month. Emil had $3 remaining after buying the canvas. Jessup knew this. Everyone knew everyone's situation in a town this small, in a disaster this complete. I cannot pay this. Then get out by sundown, or I'll have the sheriff here at first light. Your choice, Hungarian. Jessup turned and walked away without waiting for a response. He didn't need to wait. The threat was clear. Emil stood in the half-finished arch, watching the hardware man disappear through the ruins. Sundown was 4 hours away. First light was 14 hours away. He could not finish the enclosure in 4 hours, but he might finish it in 14. Paul appeared at his elbow. What did he say? He said we have to leave by morning. What are we going to do? Emil picked up his hammer. We're going to work through the night. They worked by lantern light as the temperature dropped through the 30s, the 20s. Emil's hands, already torn from the day's labor, stiffened in the cold. He wore his only gloves, thin cotton, meant for summer, and felt every nailhead, every splinter, every sharp edge. Paul mixed mud and water in a bucket until the slurry reached chinking consistency. The boy's hands turned red, then white, then red again as he warmed them periodically against his body. He didn't complain. He didn't ask to stop. By midnight, the frame was complete, rough, uneven, but structurally sound. Emil began boarding over it with salvaged siding, working by feel as much as sight in the flickering lantern light. The boards didn't fit perfectly. They weren't meant to. The gaps would be sealed with canvas and mud. At 2 o'clock in the morning, a section of framing collapsed. The crack was loud in the silent night, wood giving way, nails pulling free, 2 hours of work crumbling into a heap of broken lumber. Emil stood there, hands bleeding, eyes burning from exhaustion, and felt something break inside him too. He had failed. The math was simple. Dawn was 4 hours away. He couldn't rebuild the collapsed section and finish boarding over the rest in 4 hours. Jessup would bring the sheriff. They would find him here, surrounded by debris, clearly squatting on private property. The jail cell would be cold, but the real cold would come when they put Paul on the orphan train. Papa. Paul's voice was small but steady. I'll find more boards. The boy walked toward the stripped outbuildings without waiting for permission. Emil watched him go, a thin figure in an oversized coat, moving through the dark toward a pile of debris that might or might not contain usable lumber. He returned 10 minutes later, dragging 3 planks, each one taller than he was. His arms shook with the effort. His breath came in ragged clouds. Emil took the boards. He didn't ask how Paul had carried them. He didn't say anything at all. He rebuilt the collapsed section. He finished boarding. He applied canvas over the gaps. He chinkled with mud until his fingers couldn't feel the trowel. Dawn found them inside the enclosure, huddled under blankets on a bed of salvaged hay, too exhausted to stay awake and too cold to sleep well. The entrance, a 2-foot by 3-foot opening covered by a canvas flap, let in thin gray light and the sound of wind. The sheriff didn't come. Maybe Jessup had changed his mind. Maybe he had other problems to deal with. His store was failing. His debtors were vanishing. His world was collapsing along with everyone else's. Maybe he had simply forgotten about the Hungarian in the chimney. Or maybe he was waiting to see what happened, waiting for the cold to solve his problem for him. The first night told Emil nothing certain. They were cold. Of course they were cold. They were living in a brick tube in the mountains of Colorado in late October. But were they colder than they would have been outside? Colder than they would have been in Mazur's tent? He didn't know. He had no thermometer, no way to measure what the walls were doing. On the second day, he walked to the mercantile and spent 50 cents on a small glass thermometer, a dime store instrument, barely accurate, but better than guessing. He hung it from a nail on the interior wall and began recording numbers. October 22nd, first full day in the enclosure. Outside temperature at dawn, 23 degrees. Inside temperature, 38 degrees, 15 degrees warmer. Inside the brick tower, with no fire, no stove, no fuel burned at all. October 23rd, outside low, 19 degrees. Inside low, 36 degrees. October 24th, outside low, 24 degrees. Inside low, 40 degrees. The pattern was undeniable. The interior stayed 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outside air. Not warm by any civilized standard, 38 degrees was cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to make fingers clumsy and toes numb. But it was survivable cold. It was blanket and body heat cold. It was alive cold rather than dead cold. Mary O'Seeley appeared on the third day. She was Irish, 62 years old, a widow who lived alone in a cabin near California Gulch. Her husband had died in the avalanche of 1881, the same winter that took Lindqvist's fingers. She was the woman who had come to Emil's wife's funeral when hardly anyone else did, who had pressed his hand and said nothing because there was nothing to say. She arrived carrying a pot of lamb stew and refused to admit she had made it for them. "Too much for one person," she said, setting the pot on the ground inside the entrance. "It'll go to waste. You'd be doing me a favor taking it off my hands." Emil's pride was a luxury he'd abandoned days ago. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm not doing charity." She looked around the enclosure, the rough board walls, the canvas patches, the mud chinking already cracking in places. "They're saying you've lost your mind, living in a smokestack. They may be right. They're also saying you haven't frozen yet. That's more than some can claim." She reached under her arm and produced a folded wool blanket. "This was my husband's. I can't bear to look at it anymore. Take it off my hands." The blanket was thick, barely worn, worth more than Emil's remaining money. "Mrs. O'Chelle, Mary, and I said take it. I'm not asking permission." She turned to leave, then paused at the entrance. "The boy looks thin. Make sure he eats the meat first. Growing children need meat." She left before he could respond. Paul ate 3 bowls of stew that night. The blanket, layered with their own, made the difference between shivering sleep and actual rest. Emil lay awake watching his breath frost in the thin light filtering through gaps in the canvas, and felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Not safety, not security, but possibility. The walls were holding. The theory was working. The sun rose every day and heated 800 tons of brick, and the brick remembered, and the heat migrated slowly inward through 3 feet of masonry. And at night, the walls radiated that warmth back into the enclosed space like his grandmother's stove in Hungary. He wasn't warm. He might never be warm again. Not really. Not the way men with stoves and coal and proper cabins were warm. But he wasn't dead. and his son wasn't dead. And tomorrow there would be more sun, more heat, more Brick remembering. It was almost enough. The news spread in the way news always spreads in small towns, through gossip, exaggeration, disbelief. The Hungarian is living in the Malta stack. The Hungarian thinks Brick will keep him warm. The Hungarian hasn't frozen yet, but wait until December. Wait until the real cold comes. Oscar Lindqvist heard the rumors and shook his head. Give it time, he told anyone who asked. October's nothing, November's harder. December and January, that's when men die. If he's still alive in February, then I'll believe it. Henrik Mazur heard the rumors from his tent on Chicken Hill, where his wife huddled with their 3 children under insufficient blankets and prayed for work that wasn't coming. He thought about the numbers Emil had described. Heat conducted through Brick at 1 inch per hour, 3 feet of wall, the sun charging the structure like a battery. The numbers made a strange kind of sense, but sense wasn't the same as survival. On November 15th, Mazur's youngest daughter stopped breathing. The pneumonia had taken hold a week earlier, a wet cough that turned to fever that turned to silence. She was 2 years old. She died in a tent on a frozen hillside because her father couldn't afford walls. Emil heard about the death from Mary O'Seeley, who heard about it from the priest who performed the funeral. He didn't attend. He barely knew Mazur, but he thought about it that night, lying in the chimney with his son pressed against him, listening to the wind howl outside while the walls held 37 degrees inside. Mazur's daughter had died in the cold because there was no shelter. Emil's son was alive in the cold because there was shelter, strange shelter, impossible shelter, shelter that no one had believed in. But for how long? The first snow fell on October 29th, 3 inches melting by noon. The second snow fell on November 3rd, 6 inches, lingering for days. The temperature dropped lower each week, teens at night, 30s during the day. The interior of the chimney held always 15 to 20 degrees warmer than outside, but 15 to 20 degrees warmer than 0 was still dangerously cold. Emil began supplementing. He gathered scraps of wood from the ruins, not for heating the entire space, which would be impossible, but for small fires to cook food and add a few degrees during the worst nights. The wood was free. The warmth was marginal, but marginal was better than nothing. By early December, he had established a routine. Rise at dawn. Check the thermometer. Gather wood if needed. Walk to town to look for work, anything at all. Return by dark. Cook what little food remained. Sleep. There was no work. The mines were closed. The smelters were cold. The businesses that had served the miners were failing one by one. Jessup's hardware store finally shuttered in late November. The man himself was seen drunk in the streets, ranting about immigrants and theft. Emil's money ran out on December 10th. He had flour enough for perhaps another week. After that, he didn't know. The cold was coming. The real cold. The killing cold that Lindqvist had warned about. The kind that dropped to 20 and 30 below 0 and stayed there for days. And when it came, he would learn whether his theory was strong enough to save his son, or whether the skeptics had been right all along. Paul started coughing on December 15th. At first it was nothing, a dry hack that could have been dust from the hay bedding, cold air irritating his throat. Emil gave him water. The coughing continued. By evening, the hack had turned wet. By morning, the boy was burning with fever. Emil knew the sound. He had heard it in the smelter barracks, in the boarding houses, in the tent camps on Chicken Hill. The wet cough that preceded pneumonia, the fever that meant the body was fighting something it might not win against. Mazur's daughter had coughed like this. So had a dozen others who were now in the frozen ground of Evergreen Cemetery. He pressed his hand to Paul's forehead. The heat was alarming, far hotter than the 36-degree air surrounding them. The boy's eyes were glassy, unfocused. He shivered under both blankets even as sweat beaded on his skin. "Papa," Paul said, "I'm cold." "I know. Rest." There was a doctor in town, Dr. Emerson, who charged $2 for a house call and more for medicine. Emil had no dollars. He had flour, a little lard, the cooking pot, and the clothes on his back. He could sell nothing because he owned nothing of value. He could carry Paul to the doctor's office. The walk was 3/4 of a mile, 15 minutes in good weather. But the weather wasn't good. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees overnight and wasn't rising. The sky was gray and heavy, the kind of gray that meant snow. If he carried a feverish child through 12-degree air for 15 minutes, the cold would reach the boy's lungs. The pneumonia would worsen. He might arrive at the doctor's office with a corpse in his arms. If he stayed in the chimney, he had warmth. Not much warmth, but warmth. 36 degrees was cold, but it was dry cold, still air, no wind. The brick walls didn't pull heat from the body the way open air did. Paul could rest, could sweat out the fever, could fight the infection without the additional stress of exposure. It was a gamble either way. But Emil had been gambling since October. One more bet didn't change the math. He stayed. December 16th passed in a blur of wet coughs and restless sleep. Paul's fever climbed, held, climbed again. Emil fed him broth made from the last of Mary's stew bones and prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. The thermometer on the wall read 34 degrees. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 8. The differential held. The walls continued to radiate heat absorbed from days of autumn sun, weeks of it, stored deep in 3 feet of brick and released slowly into the enclosed space. But how much heat remained? The sun had been weak for days, hidden behind clouds that promised snow. The chimney was a battery, and batteries could run down. If the stored heat depleted before the weather broke, if the interior temperature dropped to match the outside, Emil didn't finish the thought. There was no point in finishing thoughts like that. On the morning of December 17th, he woke to silence. Not complete silence. The wind was still audible, a low moan around the brick walls. But Paul had stopped coughing. Emil reached for the boy in the darkness and felt the heat radiating from his small body. The fever hadn't broken, but the coughing had paused. The boy was sleeping, truly sleeping, for the first time in 2 days. Emil crawled to the entrance and lifted the canvas flap. The sky was wrong. He had lived in the mountains long enough to know weather, and the sky on the morning of December 17th was a color he had never seen before, a greenish gray, the color of bruises, of sickness, of something broken at a fundamental level. The air smelled of metal. The wind, which had been steady, was now gusting in unpredictable bursts, as if the atmosphere itself couldn't decide which direction to attack from. A blue norther. He had heard the old-timers talk about them. Arctic air masses that swept down from Canada faster than a horse could run, dropping temperatures 50 or 60 degrees in a matter of hours. Men caught in the open during blue northers died standing up. Cattle froze in the fields. Rivers iced over so fast that fish were trapped mid-swim. The thermometer outside the entrance read 32 degrees. Cold, but not deadly, not yet. By noon, it read 18 degrees. By 3 o'clock, it read -2. 42 degrees in 9 hours. The wind had shifted to the north and now blew steadily at 30-40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally through the air, piling drifts against the south side of the chimney, howling through the gaps in the enclosure with a sound like screaming. Emil sealed every crack he could find. He stuffed rags into gaps between boards. He piled the hay bedding against the base of the walls for insulation. He did everything a man could do with no resources and no help and no hope except the 800 tons of brick that stood between his son and the killing wind. The interior temperature dropped to 28 degrees by 4 o'clock, 24 degrees by 6, 21 degrees by 8. Outside, the temperature had fallen to -15. The wind chill was somewhere below -40, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in under 5 minutes. Paul's fever held. The boy shivered under both blankets, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his cough returning in wet, desperate bursts. Emil lay beside him, pressing his body against his son's back, trying to share what little warmth he had. The walls were still radiating. He could feel it when he pressed his palm against the brick, a faint warmth, barely perceptible, but there. The heat absorbed over weeks of autumn sun was still releasing, slowly, steadily, into the sealed space. The differential between inside and outside had stretched to 36 degrees. The chimney was doing exactly what Emil had calculated it would do, but 36 degrees of differential meant nothing if the starting point was -20. At 10 o'clock, the temperature outside fell to -22. At midnight, it fell to -26. The interior of the chimney held at 19 degrees. 19 degrees, cold enough to see your breath crystallize in the air, cold enough to make fingers clumsy and toes numb, cold enough that the water in their cooking pot had frozen solid, but not cold enough to kill. Not yet. Not if you had blankets and hay and another body to press against. Not if you were a 9-year-old boy burning with fever, generating heat from the inside even as the world tried to steal it from the outside. Emil didn't sleep. He lay in the darkness listening to his son's labored breathing and the howl of the wind and the occasional crack of tree limbs snapping under the weight of ice. He counted breaths. He counted heartbeats. He counted the hours until dawn. The crisis came at 3 in the morning, a gust of wind stronger than any before, strong enough to shake the entire enclosure, caught the canvas flap over the entrance and tore it loose. The flap had been secured with nails, with rope, with frozen mud, and none of it mattered. The wind found a weakness and exploited it, ripping the canvas free on 2 corners and folding it back like a page in a book. Cold air flooded the shelter. The effect was immediate and devastating. Emil felt the temperature drop 10 degrees in seconds. 15. The air that had been merely cold became something else entirely. A physical force, a weapon, a thing with malice and intention. It poured through the opening and filled the enclosure and wrapped around his son like a predator. Paul screamed. Not a word, not a cry, a scream. The pure animal sound of a body that knows it's dying. The boy thrashed under the blankets, fighting something he couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't escape. Emil didn't think. He threw off his blanket and crawled toward the entrance on hands and knees, moving by instinct through air so cold it burned his lungs. The canvas was flapping somewhere in the darkness, attached by one corner, snapping like a sail in a hurricane. He couldn't see it. He could only feel the wind telling him where the opening was. He reached the entrance and found the canvas by touch. His hands were bare. He'd taken off his gloves to sleep, to share skin warmth with his son, and the cold hit them like a hammer. He could feel his fingers stiffening, the blood retreating from the extremities, the flesh beginning the slow process of freezing. He grabbed the canvas and pulled it taut against the frame. The wind fought him, tried to tear it away again, tried to rip it from his grip. He held on. With his other hand, he fumbled for the hammer he'd left near the entrance, found it, raised it, drove a nail through the canvas corner and into the wooden frame. The nail bent. He drove it anyway. He found another nail, drove that one too. The canvas held on the first corner. He shifted to the second corner. His hands weren't working properly anymore. The fingers wouldn't close all the way, wouldn't grip the nail the way they should. He dropped 2 nails before managing to hold one steady. He swung the hammer, missed, swung again, connected. The canvas was secure. Emil crawled back into the shelter and pulled the entrance flap closed behind him. His hands were white, not red, not pink, but the pale, waxy white of frostbitten flesh. He couldn't feel them. He couldn't feel anything below the wrists. He pressed his hands against the brick wall. The wall was warm, not hot. Nothing in this shelter would ever be hot again, but warm. Warmer than his frozen flesh, warmer than the 19-degree air, warmer than anything else in his world. The bricks had absorbed heat from 100 autumn afternoons and were releasing it still, slowly, steadily, faithfully, even now, even in the depths of a blue norther, even with death howling outside. He held his hands against the brick and felt the pins and needles of returning circulation. The white faded to red. The red faded to pink. Feeling returned, first the deep ache of cold injury, then the sharp sting of warming tissue, then something like normal sensation. He crawled back to his son. Paul had stopped screaming. The boy was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard Emil could hear them, but he was alive. The blankets were still wrapped around him. The hay was still piled beneath him. The walls were still radiating heat. Emil lay down beside his son and pulled both blankets over them and pressed his body against the boy's back and waited for dawn. The storm held for 3 days. 3 days of wind that never dropped below 30 miles per hour. 3 days of temperatures that never rose above -10. 3 days of snow that piled against the south side of the chimney until the drifts reached 8 feet high, burying the lower boards of the enclosure and adding, accidentally, another layer of insulation. Inside, the temperature held. It dropped to 17 degrees on the second day, then recovered to 21 on the third as the sun, invisible behind clouds but still present, still pouring radiation onto the brick, began recharging the thermal mass. The differential between inside and outside stretched to 40 degrees, 45, exactly what Emil's calculations had predicted for extreme conditions. Paul's fever didn't break, but it didn't climb either. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, drinking broth when Emil could get it past his cracked lips, coughing weakly but steadily, fighting the infection with a 9-year-old's stubborn refusal to surrender. On the morning of December 20th, the wind stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that Emil thought he had gone deaf. He lay in the hay listening to nothing, no howl, no moan, no crack of breaking limbs, and felt tears freezing on his cheeks before he realized he was crying. He crawled to the entrance and lifted the canvas flap. The sky was blue. The sun was rising over the eastern peaks. The temperature, according to his thermometer, was -4 degrees, still cold, but 40 degrees warmer than the worst of the storm. The snow that had buried half the enclosure glittered in the early light like a field of diamonds. He walked outside on legs that had forgotten how to move properly. The world was transformed, white and silent and still, as if the storm had scoured away everything that wasn't essential. Smoke rose from chimneys in town. The sound of a distant church bell carried through the thin air. He was alive. His son was alive. The chimney had held. Paul's fever broke on December 22nd. Emil woke to find the boy sitting up, blankets pooled around his waist, looking at the interior of the shelter with clear eyes for the first time in a week. "I'm hungry," Paul said. Emil had never heard more beautiful words. The food situation was desperate. They were down to a handful of flour and some lard scraped from the bottom of a tin, but Mary Osile appeared that afternoon as if summoned by Providence. She brought bread, dried beef, a jar of preserved apples, and asked no questions about how they had survived. "The whole town is talking," she said. 11 dead in the county from the storm, families frozen in their wagons, men caught in the open, but the Hungarian in the chimney lived. She looked at Emil with something like wonder. How did you do it? I didn't do anything. The bricks did it. The bricks. They store heat. The sun warms them during the day. The heat moves through slowly and comes out at night. It's like a stove that burns sunlight instead of coal. Mary looked at the walls, at the rough boards covering the entrance, at the boy eating bread with the desperate concentration of the starving. I don't understand how that works, she said, but I believe it does. Oskar Lindqvist came on December 23rd. He walked through the ruins of the Malta smelter with the careful steps of a man who expected to find a grave. What he found instead was Emil sitting outside the shelter, face gaunt but alive, watching his son eat porridge in the weak morning sun. Lindqvist didn't speak at first. He circled the shelter, examined the construction, touched the boards and canvas and mud chinking. Then he crouched and crawled through the entrance. When he emerged, his face had changed. I've been in this country 40 years, he said. Survived 19 winters in Leadville. Lost 3 fingers to the cold. I thought I knew everything there was to know about staying alive up here. He looked at the chimney, at the walls rising above them, at the sun already warming the eastern face. I was wrong. You said I would freeze by Christmas. I did. You said my boy would be an orphan by New Year's. Lindqvist nodded slowly. I said that too, and I was wrong about that too. He extended his maimed hand, the one with 3 fingers missing. I apologize. I told you what I believed, and what I believed was false. This, he gestured at the shelter, at the chimney, at the whole improbable structure. This is something I never saw coming. The physics isn't complicated, Emil said. Brick stores heat. The sun provides heat. If you trap it instead of letting it escape, you don't need to explain. I felt the walls. They're warm. Lindqvist shook his head. Warm walls in the middle of a norther. If you'd told me that a month ago, I'd have called you a liar. Now I've felt it with my own hand. He left without saying anything else. But by evening, 3 other men had come to see the chimney shelter. By the next day, there were a dozen. Word was spreading in the way word always spreads in small towns, through wonder, through disbelief, through the simple fact that a man who should have died was somehow still breathing. Henrik Mazur arrived in the first week of January. He looked older than he had in October, thinner, grayer, with the hollow eyes of a man who had buried a child and nearly lost the rest. His remaining children walked slowly beside him, their feet wrapped in bandages that couldn't quite hide the blackened toes beneath. Frostbite, the marks they would carry for the rest of their lives. I heard what happened, Mazur said. The storm, your boy's fever, how you held the entrance closed with your bare hands. Emil said nothing. I told you the chimney was a coffin. I told you the bricks would suck the warmth out of your body. Mazur looked at the shelter, at the walls, at the thin smoke rising from the small fire Emil had built for cooking. I was the one who was wrong. Your daughter is dead. Nothing changes that. Mazur's voice was flat, matter of fact. But my other children are alive, barely. The tent is gone, collapsed in the storm. We've been sleeping in an abandoned cabin, but there's another family claiming it. They have a rifle. We don't. He didn't ask directly. He didn't need to. The Harrison stack is larger than this one, Emil said. The walls are thicker. It could hold several families. I don't know how to seal it. I don't understand the principles. I'll show you. They worked together for 3 days. Mazur was stronger than Emil, but no more skilled with carpentry. They failed together, made mistakes together, corrected those mistakes together. By January 10th, The Harrison Works chimney was sealed, a larger enclosure than Emil's, with room for Mazur's family and two other families who had nowhere else to go. The interior held 33 degrees while outside the temperature sat at 4 below. Mazur's wife wept when she felt the walls. The conversions came slowly at first, then faster. Two men from the mining camp sealed a smaller stack near California Gulch. A group of 7 single men without families took over an abandoned charcoal kiln using the same principles. By late January, perhaps 15 people were sheltering in sealed masonry structures across the Leadville district. Not all the shelters worked equally well. Some stacks were too small, their thermal mass insufficient to maintain the differential. Others were poorly sealed, their enclosures losing heat faster than the walls could replace it. A few faced the wrong direction, getting too little sun to charge the brick properly. But the ones that worked. Men who should have frozen were alive. Children who should have died were eating porridge and complaining about the cold like ordinary children, complaining about ordinary discomfort. Emil shared his knowledge with anyone who asked. He walked to the new shelters and pointed out problems, gaps in the chinking, entrances too large, insufficient bedding. He explained the physics as best he understood it: thermal mass, thermal lag, the slow migration of heat through dense material. Most men didn't follow the explanation. They didn't need to. They just needed to know what to build and how to build it. Franklin Jessup was spotted in town in late January, drunk and diminished. His hardware store shuttered, and his wealth evaporated. Someone told him about the chimney dwellers, the people living in the sealed stacks he had once threatened to evict. His response, reported secondhand through the gossip network, was contempt without force. Let the foreigners burrow like animals. It's what they're suited for. But Jessup had no sheriff to summon now, no leverage to apply, no power to threaten. He was just another ruined man in a town full of ruined men. His threats meant nothing. His opinion meant less. The Hungarian in the chimney had survived. The skeptics had been wrong, and Winter, for once, had not won. By the end of January 1894, at least 15 people were living in sealed chimney bases across the Leadville district. 3 stacks had been converted: the Malta, the Harrison, and the smaller structure near California Gulch that had become home to a rotating cast of desperate men. Emil had helped seal each one, teaching Mazur and others the principles that had kept him alive: thermal mass, sealed base, low entrance to trap rising warm air. He asked for nothing in return. When spring finally came and the survivors found other shelter, proper cabins, boarding houses, rooms in a town slowly climbing back from disaster, the chimney dwellings emptied out. No one wrote them down. No newspaper printed the story. The knowledge passed from mouth to mouth and then faded like footprints in wet snow. The stacks themselves would stand for decades, monuments to an industry that had abandoned the men who built them. Emil Varga found work at the Arkansas Valley Smelting Company in the summer of 1894. It was the only smelter in Leadville that had survived the silver crash, still operating because it processed lead as well as silver. The pay was $3 a day, the same wage he had earned at Malta before the world collapsed. He moved into a proper cabin with a proper stove and proper walls, and his son Paul returned to school and learned to read and write and do arithmetic like the American children around him. The records show Emil's name on the company payroll in 1895, 1896, 1897. After that, he disappears, not dead perhaps, just unrecorded, one of thousands of Hungarian immigrants who came to America seeking fortune, found labor, lost everything, and vanished into the vastness of a country that rarely bothered to write down their names. On December 17th, 1893, the temperature in Leadville fell 42 degrees in 9 hours. Oscar Lindqvist, who had survived 19 Colorado winters and lost 3 fingers to frostbite, said the words that everyone believed. "A man without a stove is a dead man walking. You go into that stack, you'll freeze before Christmas, and that boy of yours will be an orphan by New Year's." Emil Varga spent that night in a sealed brick tower with his sick son, watching the thermometer hold at 19 degrees, while the world outside dropped to -26. The walls radiated heat they had absorbed from the sun, heat stored in 800 tons of brick released slowly through the darkest hours. The boy's fever broke 5 days later. The skeptics stopped predicting death. The Malta stack stood for another 40 years before it finally crumbled. No plaque marks the spot. No one remembers the name of the man who lived inside it. But for one winter, in a town that silver built and silver abandoned, the sun itself heated a home that had no stove, and the bricks remembered.